right, so today we're going to talk about writing a conclusion. And just like we said in morning meeting today, this is not writing a conclusion like at the end of your 5-paragraph essay. This is writing a conclusion after you finished a science experiment. So let's quickly review the steps of the scientific process that we have already gone through. What is the first step of the scientific process? Jordan.
Is it safe to be tested?
Which is called what? Figuring out if it's a
Testable.
testable question. So your first step is getting a question. What's your second step? Terrence? Gathering your research. After we gather our research, what's the next thing we figure out? Lily?
Variables.
Your variables, and then your, Levi? Hypothesis. After you figure out those things, what do you have to do next? Diego?
Protection.
Not protection.
Procedure.
Procedure. Similar words. Okay, so procedure, you have to write out your materials list and the steps in which you're going to do the experiment. And then yesterday we talked about while you're doing the experiment, what do you need to be doing? We talked about this yesterday. Jaden?
Observing it or
Chris?
Writing down a picture.
Okay, so you're drawing your observations and you're also collecting what, Darnell? Data. You're writing some things down. And we also talked about different types of graphs. So part of the conclusion process is after you collect your data, you graph your numbers and then you use that graph to answer some questions. Why do you think a conclusion is important in a science experiment? Yep. Okay, so why do you think a conclusion is important in a science experiment? Haley?
Because it basically wraps it all up of how you're doing your experiment.
It wraps up the whole experiment. Okay, why else? Sienna?
Because if you do your experiment and then at the end you don't explain what happened, so if someone did do your science experiment, they wouldn't know what you got, so that they couldn't see if they got the right thing.
Right, just like we talked about with our making sure our procedure is precise and our drawings are precise, as if other scientists wanted to recreate that experiment. Mackenzie?
Just figuring out the answer.
Yeah, you want to figure out the answer to your testable question. That's the whole point of doing this experiment. You had a testable question at the beginning of the experiment and you did all this work and now you want to just be able to say, so what happened? All right, so there are a few things that when you're doing a science conclusion, you need to make sure you talk about in your paragraph. So a conclusion is usually 1 to 2 paragraphs. And I'm not going to put a limit or an amount of sentences you need to have because it's less about how many sentences you have and more about if you answered these questions. So we're going to write down the questions in our notebook so that we know what they are. And then I also have these cool little flip chart things on rings that I'm going to have around the room so that when we are doing our STEM fair projects or we are doing a science experiment together, you can take one of these and just quickly flip through and look to see what the questions are. All right. So, first question that you need to answer. Explain how the experiment was set up. So this is basically just like a quick review of your experiment. How did you set it up? How did you test it? Question number 2. What items were kept the same in your experiment? What is that variable called when we keep something the same? Darasini?
A constant.
The constant. So this is where you're describing your constants. Remember, we said we have to identify what our constants are because we need to make sure that we're only testing one thing. Ben, why don't you just come sit at the table over here instead of getting up? Constant. Okay, question number 3. Were there any discrepant events? Discrepant events mean like anything that maybe when you tested it the first time, the second time it didn't work, or maybe you had like a problem that you had to figure out how to fix it. Discrepancy is anything that went wrong. How many people in here have done a science experiment and when they were testing it, something happened and you totally failed? Like it was bad. You had to figure out how to fix it because it didn't work how you thought it was going to.
I had to find out how to fix my kitchen.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's important to put that in here because if a scientist is trying to recreate your experiment, they need to know what went wrong just in case they want to try to do it and they mess up.
Don't do coping pills.
Mhm.
Sugar. I was doing that for a while.
So, the next question, how did you organize your data? So this is where you talk about, okay, I measured the distance that I kicked the ball in feet and I wrote it down in a chart, and then afterwards I created a bar graph to show all of the different measurements that I took. This is a way for you to explain your thinking. The 5th question, were the results what you expected? This is where you talk about, was your hypothesis correct or not? Was your hypothesis correct? Because remember, your hypothesis is your educated guess, so we want to know, was it correct or were you completely off? All right, and finally, question number 6. Do your results answer your testable question? This is usually where we talk about if you had to, do you need to test anything else? Or maybe do you need to do the experiment again and fix something? Or maybe if you were going to do the experiment again, what would you fix? This is where we talk about that. If I wrote it, then you wrote it. Okay, so on Monday or Tuesday of next week, we're going to do an experiment together. We are going to fill out a lab sheet and we're going to go through all of the steps of the scientific process. When we get to the conclusion, we are going to write this together. That will be our practice for writing conclusions. That way, on Thursday, we're going to do another experiment, and this one you're going to do completely by yourself. And that's going to be kind of like your test at the end of this unit. So instead of us giving you a test that you have to do like multiple choice, your test is going to be do the experiment and fill out the lab sheet. Yes, Lindsay?
Will we all be given the same test?
Yep. You're all going to get the same experiment and the same lab sheet.
When is
STEM Fair? We're actually going to do STEM Fair earlier this year.
Oh.
So instead of doing it after Christmas break, the whole thing is going to be done before Christmas break. So we're actually going to start on that within the next few weeks.
Christmas.
Mm-hmm.